Annalee, thanks so much for coming. I'm so excited to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks again for having me.
I want to jump right in to something that I am very fond of that I tell people about a lot, and that is your definition of the scientific project. And I first heard you talk about this during a long now talk, and I think it's actually one of the best articulations I've heard, and one of the best kind of modern visions for what science and technology can be. Would you mind kind of giving me that definition?
Yeah, I think the thing about the scientific project is that we need to be redefining it to be more inclusive. We've been kind of in a mode for, I'd say, a couple centuries now of imagining that science should really be in the hands of trained professional scientists. And these people should have gone to universities that we recognize as being, important universities, and that those are really the only people who can kind of drive us forward in terms of innovation and discoveries. And yet, throughout this whole time, we know that there have been thousands and thousands of amateur scientists who've been helping those scientists who've actually been making discoveries that have later been kind of taken up by sort of mainstream official science. And also, there's a huge body of social research and humanities work and art and culture that also needs to be thought of as part of that scientific project, which is ultimately just a project about how do we get to the future by making a series of mistakes and learning from them. That's basically the scientific process, is that we continue to try, and then when we make a mistake, we say, oh crap, that's why we called it a hypothesis and not a theory, because now we can toss it away and have a new hypothesis. And as a science fiction writer, as well as a science journalist, for me, I've seen kind of both sides, the sort of humanities side of the scientific project and the more science side, the more traditional professional side. And I really think that as we move into the future as civilizations on Earth, we really need to be paying attention to how storytelling and, again, these kinds of projects that we think of as humanities actually fit into helping us do science better. And that also means acknowledging that people can be engaging in the scientific project without having a fancy degree and some kind of professional affiliation. And so I think that's what you meant by my definition of the scientific project. It's really just an effort to include as many people as we can and admit that, as Morty says in Rick and Morty, science is more of an art than a science.
Yeah, I was just writing about the idea of belief in science, and I was pulling old E.O. Wilson quotes, and he even talks about it. It's like, he talks about it like writing like a novel, right? Like you have this kind of idea of the story, and then you go about filling it in with rigor. I've been thinking a lot about open science, and this was kind of sparked by rereading Michael Nielsen's book. I don't know if you ever read Reinventing Discovery.
Mm-mm.
I read it, I don't know when it came out. It must have been like 7 or 8 years ago. And it for me, having been working on these tools for science, right? Being an amateur citizen scientist and working on these tools, that was my introduction to this vision for open science, which seemed to me like, oh my gosh, there's all these amateurs who are working from the outside, and there's all these people from the inside who are trying to break science out of this ivory tower. And it was really inspirational for me at the time. And it's a lot like what you're describing, the scientific project. And yet open science kind of feels like it fell flat, like it kind of stalled out almost at this kind of preprint idea. What do you think about this kind of open science movement and, the progress we've made in unifying or getting towards that bolder vision? What's your take on the work we've done so far and what we can do next?
I think that it's, it's going to be a slow process.
Mhm.
One of the mistakes that we have made, I think, especially in like the last 20, 30 years, especially people like us who are kind of in science and technology. And so we're kind of listening to tech people and we're listening to science people. Like tech people have this idea that like everything is going to be fast and then it's going to get faster, 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 faster. And it's like, guess what? No,
Mhm.
that's actually
Mhm.
not um, that might be how capitalism can work, but that isn't, capitalism and science aren't the same thing. And they actually have a really like toxic relationship sometimes. Like maybe they're a little codependent, they need some therapy, because, like
Yeah.
science is often, like I said, it's slow. It's a process of making mistakes and figuring out what we did wrong and iterating again. And the fact that you and I can have a conversation about open science and we both kind of know what that means, and a lot
Mhm.
of, your audience is going to know what that means. Scientists and non-scientists know what it means. That's a huge change. I mean, I remember
Yeah.
when Mike Eisen was first pitching the idea of the Public Library of Science family of journals, which at the
Mhm.
time it was just this one journal and it was going to be just kind of biology.
Mhm.
And I was a baby journalist at the time, and I interviewed him about it. And I was coming from free software ideas, and I was like, "Yay! It's like free software. It's going
Right.
to be something that we can share. It's not free as in beer; it's free as in speech and ideas."
Right.
Um, and I think now that's a widely accepted model. Yes, it's been criticized. Yes, it's not perfect, as it turns out. There's scammers everywhere,
Right.
but I mean, PLOS is thriving. There's other journals that are trying to make significant parts of their archives open. And those are open because uh, people who are not affiliated with institutions want to be able to access that information without paying $30 just to see an
Mhm.
article. Um, and so I'm impressed with the fact that that pressure, just in that one example of open access journals, that pressure from PLOS really did open up
Yeah.
some journals that hadn't been before. And again, not perfect. Not everything is open. Some publishers continue to be douches, and I'm like really just like hoarding their information.
Mhm.
Um, but I think also the success of so many citizen science projects to gather information about animal behavior, for
Mhm.
example. Social media has, like places like YouTube have become like a weird side effect of YouTube has been
Mhm.
kind of the elevation of a lot of citizen scientists who are just observing animals and life, natural life in their backyards or in their towns. Scientists frequently use YouTube to figure out stuff about animal behavior. And they're like, oh,
Mhm.
wow, here's a crow doing this right here on YouTube. Like we had no idea that they did this before. So I'm happy with our progress. I do think it would be great if it could be much faster. I do think um, the next stage is the ball is kind of in the court of well-funded institutions and traditional science institutions to start acknowledging all of this work and start incorporating it into curricula, into research programs.
Mhm.
I'd love to see more of that. I do think that there are some groups that are doing that. I'm not saying that it's not happening, but I would love it if uh, you know, people who were trying to establish themselves in the scientific field, if their peers would evaluate their engagement with community or
Yeah.
their engagement with citizen scientists. Or what if we started thinking about inviting very accomplished citizen scientists to be part of groups of part of university staffs,
Mhm.
make really rethink what it means to be a scholar and what it means to be a teacher.
Yeah.
All that stuff is up for grabs right now. The university is being really rethought, sometimes violently and depressingly. But yeah,
Yeah. And I think especially this past year, I mean, like, everything's getting accelerated and
yeah,
universities are the pressure that they were under, I think is even higher now. Um, I'll tell you what I'm seeing, and maybe if you, I'd be interested in your reaction in this.
Yeah.
I was thinking about like um, the maker movement, and I was thinking about like it was thinking about like the waves of hackers. I was reading a book about JCR Licklider, and then I was reading about Stephen Levy's that kind of era of hackers, and
Mhm.
it this idea of amateurism is really important, and like people doing something just because they love it. And um, it also was interesting to me that this kind of amateurism seems to kind of come in waves. Like like there's real excitement, then people kind of get burned out. And some people start companies, and then they're under different pressures, and you know,
Yeah.
and then there's always like a second, these different waves of amateurism, or like people who really love it and care. And I think the web has done a good job of naming this, right? Like there was the web 2.0, and now they're talking about web 3, and it's like different kind of zeitgeists that get to come through. And i'm I'm excited doing these interviews. I feel like there's this open science 2.0 that's kind of brewing. And
Nice. I like to hear that.
yeah, and you use some language that I think is actually really important, which is, you said, you referred to you and I as like having one foot in science and kind of one foot in technology, right? Like
Mhm.
actually, building tools and in knowing what running companies is all about, and telling those stories to a broader audience. You also have your foot in the science fiction space, which I think is a really, that's that's a whole other, you called it the cultural wing of the
Yeah.
scientific project. But I've been calling it kind of sci-tech, because I think like the people I'm talking to are kind of like not so concerned about the um, like preprint. They're just not getting caught up in the old discussions. They're
Mhm.
really interested in like building new tools or building the next iteration of that. What do you think? Am I just do I have blinders on because I'm doing these interviews, or are you seeing some optimism and some hope for that next wave?
I see a lot of optimism and hope for it. And I do think it's really interesting to think about those waves of interest in citizen science. I think, I write a lot about history, and I think there was a wave of citizen science kind of toward the end of the 19th century, too. And so I think it's interesting. And that was also a time of technological acceleration, and capitalist acceleration as well. And so, and also in the United States, a lot of horrific um, economic pain. But I think what we're seeing now is, the reason I kind of brought up the 19th century is that we're seeing a wave of people who are dealing with the realities of climate change, and are
Mm,
seeing, we're just starting to see the thin end of the wedge in terms of, how climate change is going to affect um, everyday life, flooding, fires, unprecedented fires. There's a lot of evidence that suggests pandemics are going to be statistically more likely to take place due to climate change causing all kinds of secondary effects, like even migration, or people, as they develop uh, wilderness areas, are getting exposed to new kinds of pathogens. Um, so this is going to be something that's very concrete and real for the new generation. And there are many, many projects out there that are citizen science projects that are designed to deal with questions around alternative energy, alternative systems of infrastructure development, everything from like sewer systems to composting systems, how to build on the land, what kinds of materials to use, what does it mean to build a village or a community or a city.
mhm,
All of these things are going to be part of that next wave.
mhm,
It's really going to be about our interaction with the physical world. And I think, in the world of tech, I think there's this long-standing, like, sort of sarcastic joke about the Internet of Things. Like, we don't even know what to
mhm,
call it. Internet of Things sounds incredibly stupid. Connected devices was a term we were going to use for a while. And all of these things can kind of get rolled up into this idea of smart cities or smart farms. And I think those are actually, as much as we want to titter about the idea of Internet of Things, that's so, 2003 or whatever. Right. I don't know. Is Internet of Things is maybe 2013. It's still, nobody takes it seriously. But I think that again, like we are going to see it manifest in this new wave of city projects.
Yeah, and to kind of tie that into science, like even tighter, I think like what we found in the maker movement was like, okay, Eric and I just really wanted to build a robot to explore this cave, and like, we had, hopes and ambitions. I think we were really surprised at how far we were able to get.
Was that really the origin? You just wanted to explore a cave? Come on.
No. It was actually like that was
really
well, so Eric really wanted to explore this cave.
Okay.
He was building this robot, and I met him and saw this project and thought, like, this is really fun, and I want to be involved, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who wants to be involved. And I had spent time with ocean scientists and DIY biologists especially, and was just kind of seeing this latent demand that I had, that others had, to participate in exploration and science.
Yeah.
And so I kind of, my contribution to that project was really just making sure that there was an architecture for participation. And I think by, like at the beginning, we were just talking about it, which is kind of saying that, not really knowing what that meant. And there was just a lot of demand. And I think, then, a year later, we were presenting at ocean conferences with leading ocean scientists and technologists.
And now people use them all the time. Like those UAVs are like key to so many projects, they're really.
They are. And I think like this idea that the tools that science uses, because science is a really, professional science is an expensive proposition, but maybe it doesn't have to be, right? Like this is the kind of the things I think we kind of poked a hole in was, maybe we can have lower cost tools. And now there's this whole open hardware for science movement that's really exciting. And I think there's a lot of good reason to believe that the costs of asking questions will continue to go down. Like I think the walls of the ivory tower are built, by these paywalls, these journal paywalls, but they're also really built with expensive equipment. And I think that can change. But the big thing we learned was that there was this like blind spot, right? Like all the professional scientists were amazed that we were putting things on Kickstarter and doing things in this different way. And it's got me kind of really looking at these different blind spots that traditional science has. And one of those blind spots, I think, is the role of science fiction. And there's been like the hieroglyph project, and there's people who acknowledge it in private in these conversations. When I'm talking to scientists, everyone talks about the role of it for them personally. But I think it's one of those things that it's still kind of fighting for a seat at the table. Do you think that's fair? Like just to be recognized that it's like this is a really core part of what we're doing.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that this goes back to what I said at the beginning about how we still are struggling with this, I would call it almost like an unconscious bias that like the people who do science are these very specific kinds of people with specific training, with specific kinds of jobs. And we don't always even like I say, it's an unconscious bias. Sometimes it's a very conscious one and screw those people. But I mean, the people who are like, oh, well, that person, they just write silly books, they can't be part of the scientific project, even though I'm devouring their books and their ideas are like living in my unconscious and like, maybe even inspiring some ideas. So I do think that there is acknowledgement, but also, it's almost like for scientists, for traditional scientists, science fiction is like a guilty pleasure. Like they don't quite want to admit that it's an inspiration or that it could guide their work. I think there's two places where that's not true. And I think it's really interesting for us to think about that going forward. And one is that I think there's a growing professionalization of futurists who are basically applied science fiction writers who, for example, the government of Canada hires futurists. There are actually university programs to train people to be foresight analysts. We have in the States, we have a lot of nonprofits that do foresight analysis. We have the Institute of Future, which does a lot of great consulting work with governments and corporations and NGOs. So I think that's one place where we actually see, for example, like the government of Canada might say, okay, you're going to do this project related to science. Like, why don't we hire, basically a science fiction writer to write some stuff about where it might go right, where it might go wrong, what might happen. The other place I will say really quickly is in public policy. I have argued for a long time that public policy and legislation, for example, like the infrastructure bill that the Biden administration is working on, that is a form of applied science fiction as well, because that's a way of saying, this is where we want to go next. This is what we aspire to. Here are the kinds of technologies and projects we want to put money into, but it's all future focused, right? It's all about where we could go if this money was used, and if these projects succeed. And so things like the Green New Deal, which is obviously a direct inspiration for this infrastructure bill, the Green New Deal is a little bit sci-fi. And my favorite kind of sci-fi, because it's basically utopian eco-fiction. And I think that's what the infrastructure bill is too. And that's the kind of science fiction that that I think we can take, the public and even scientists can take more seriously. And that's because there's actual money behind it to turn ideas into something, and I think that's what science fiction lacks, is that we have all these great ideas, but we aren't, handing out money to anyone saying like, hey, you want to make my book come true? And that's where government comes in, and, that kind of side of things is really helpful. Yay, government.
Yeah, that's true. I think, that's interesting. I mean, like, I've been writing this series around like scientific angels, like we're missing this kind of persona of person who can make these bets like out at the edges and can bet on kind of the long shots of science that's happening. And I think it's been a really important part of the like startup ecosystem to have people who can like be the true believers. And anyway, so in kind of doing a lot of this research, like I'm like seeing, again, with this kind of being queued up to look for blind spots, seeing these blind spots in this kind of, in the kind of government funded research, which still just totally dominates the agenda, right? Like peer review is something like
basic research. Yeah, for sure.
It does.
Yeah.
And it also, these new philanthropists who are getting into science, like very few of them are imagining anything different than what the NSF and the NIH are doing. They're kind of like replicating the peer review process, replicating a lot, pulling the same people in. There's not as much creativity as you may think. Like Howard Hughes Medical Institute, maybe, and is a kind of an example of somebody who funds a little bit different. But I think that the spectrum of what could be funded and what could be done at those earliest stages, like I'm actually fairly like disappointed that we're not trying more stuff. And I'm fairly disappointed that like the discussion isn't more robust. Like the science angels are one thing, but I think we could be doing a lot of creative stuff. Like, you're just talking about, science fiction authors we can't fund anything. Well, it's like, well, maybe they should be, maybe they should be making funding decisions.
Or maybe we should be there should be more science fiction writers or speculative writers included in committees that are granting funding. And there have been points when the US government has done that, right? There have always been projects where science fiction writers got pulled in. I'm working on a book right now about the history of psychological warfare in the United States.
Hmm.
And in the States, the architect of our version of psychological warfare, which obviously is goes back thousands of years, but ours is kind of cooked up during the World War II by a science fiction writer who was working for Army intelligence. His real name was Paul Linebarger, and he wrote a book called Psychological Warfare, outlining how to do it. And it's a training manual. But under the name Cordwainer Smith, he wrote award-winning science fiction. He was a very widely read, widely respected science fiction writer who actually wrote a lot about the horrors of war, which is very interesting. He had this kind of double life. But yeah, so there's a guy, right, who really
Right.
shaped government policy around at least the military. And his view was you need psychological warfare to prevent hot warfare. He was like, the goal is always to not kill anyone. We'd rather just mess with their minds and kind of pacify them. So, which is a kind of a horrible thing to say. It's still a bad thing, but I guess you'd rather it be, controlling people's minds with Facebook than like outright murdering them. So and there's been other moments when the government did that, but I wanted to ask you a question because you got me thinking about this whole idea of like kind of maker movements having these moments and then having these kind of sleepy times.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's also, there's like a kind of a bouncing of the innovation ball back and forth between industry and government, because there have been times when I feel like industry, capitalist economy has been giving us a lot of terrific innovation. And then the government has been like doing almost nothing, or just investing in the same old stuff, or even cutting back money for science. And then there's these moments, and I think we're in one right now, where the government is suddenly able to step up and say, actually, we're going to invest billions of dollars in scientific projects related to the environment. Because that's, again, to go back to this infrastructure bill, part of it is really about investing in science, because we're going to need scientists and engineers to do a lot of these projects, especially the ones around climate issues. And so I wonder if that's what's going on. I wonder if it's kind of like we're bouncing over to the government as being kind of an innovator, and like industry is getting a little sleepy, and maybe we don't want these angels to be coming from Silicon Valley. Maybe we want them to be coming from, policy, wherever they're doing their policy. It doesn't have to be DC, that's for sure.
Yeah. So it's a good question. And
What do you think?
well, here's my gut.
Okay.
Is people because I wrote this book about the maker movement, and it's like I wrote it
Yeah.
in 2012, and it was like the most optimistic time for the maker movement, and it was just a super like it was just a great opportunity for me too. So everyone was just, the future was unlimited, the tools were amazing, and everything was possible. And I got swept up in that, and that kind of idealism combined with this spirit of possibility, I think is ephemeral. I think it my personal opinion is innovation doesn't happen in industry or government. It happens when the right groups of people get together and are given the tools and the permission to dream.
Yeah.
And so when those kind of conditions bubble up, like whether it's through technological changes or through the an overabundance of capital that's allowing for risky things, you're going to see interesting stuff. And so my sense is, that those kinds of scenes are going to bubble up, and they happen in like weird places at weird times in different industries, but it's they follow these kind of almost predictable patterns of sameness where people like there's just something happening. And so I think that this huge infusion of capital around climate, and I hope it comes into conservation too, is really great, but and they might get a lot of credit for it. But I think there was a lot of really smart people who have been laying the groundwork for that
Oh,
for a while.
sure. Well, and
And
same thing for, tech investment too. Like tech
yeah,
investment is always like Elon Musk came along and did a bunch of stuff. And it's like, yeah, whatever. Like he gave some money to some people who did some stuff. And then he like, went on Twitter, which is lovely. I'm glad that he has a home on Twitter, but like he's not actually inventing anything. But he's laying the groundwork, right? He's making the conditions possible for other people to invent stuff. And that's great. And I think that I'm I am thinking that just like in the 1930s with the Works Progress Administration, where again, it wasn't like dudes in the government were cooking up stuff, but they were allowing other people to have the time and the money to come up with a lot of new ideas, scientific ideas, ideas about social benefits, ideas about how to organize you know, uh, basically the welfare state,
mhm,
which now I realize there's so much baggage around welfare that we don't talk about that anymore. But we are talking about things like universal basic income,
mhm,
and that's again another way in which governments can help just provide a groundwork for people to do to go to school, and to
right,
become inventors. And
right,
Los Angeles is starting a UBI program, and
yeah,
I was like, awesome! Like this is great. This is experimentation that we want to be doing. So I think so. I guess my utopian or hopeful feeling is that we might be entering a phase where we're going to be seeing government playing a role in helping innovation and helping innovators.
yeah,
And that's great. Like you said, it shouldn't matter. Is it from the government? Is it from Silicon Valley investors? Who cares? As long as the right people are able to do the work.
yeah. Have you ever spent time in DC?
In DC, yeah, quite a
Yeah.
bit of time.
And like, have you ever, because I was on like an advisory panel for NOAA. So I'd have to
Oh,
go to these
nice.
board meetings and I would like,
Yeah.
I like kind of got into the like the nitty gritty of like how these budgets are allocated and how decisions are made. And um,
Yeah,
it was really,
I worked with the AGU for a year, so it's very
okay,
similar
okay.
kind of, yeah. A lot of meetings.
Because,
I was incredibly unhelpful in their meetings. Not like I was just sitting there going like I have nothing to add, but you guys are doing great.
oh, I just thrived on being like a, not like a annoying problem, but like a, well, why don't we just do this? Like, just like questioning like why they couldn't do it. And of course, like nothing really happened. Actually citizen science became like exploded in popularity. And that was like the campaign I was running on was like, we need to
Hmm.
be thinking about this. And it actually, laws were passed and it was a dramatic improvement for that. But I don't know. And then having like, seen a little bit of it inside of big companies, like I always am like, I've just become really skeptical of bureaucracies,
Yeah,
whether that's,
anything that gets too big, hey, like because it doesn't matter if it's Google or if it's
yeah,
a regulatory agency.
yeah,
It's just big.
exactly. So, anyways, I don't want to complain about bureaucracies. What I do want to hear about is this new book you're working on. So maybe we can use that as like as a segue to talk about your process because I have a ton of questions about your process. So
Yeah,
maybe we
actually,
can do
for
that.
my process, I'll talk to you about the book that I just published.
Okay.
We can talk about psychological warfare in a year when I'm done with that project.
Okay. Cool.
I'm just starting that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, let's talk about process.
Sounds good. Do you want to share your screen? Are you up for the research mode?
I am. Let me do my screen sharing. Okay. All right, great. All right, so you should be seeing a page in, let's see. So you're seeing my Evernote page here, right?
Yep. I'm seeing it.
Okay, great. So should I just walk you through?
Yeah. How do you do it?
What do you want? Okay,
Well, so I guess the question is that I like actually really want to ask you
Yeah.
It, um, do you do a fiction and nonfiction work at the same time, or do you like are you working 6 months on a project or a year on a project, and then you'll switch to fiction and nonfiction? How do you like? What's the pie chart of your time?
It is definitely a fungible pie chart, which sounds like a really bad math rock band. But uh, I'm always working on a couple of projects at the same time. And generally one is fiction and one is nonfiction. And so my most recent book, my most recent book, For Lost Cities, which is a nonfiction book about archaeology. It took me about 7 years to research it because I had to go all over the world to visit archaeological sites and interview archaeologists and kind of see with my own eyes what was going
Mhm,
on. And during that time, I wrote a couple of novels.
mhm.
And most, I think, saliently, I wrote Future of Another Timeline, which is about time travel. And that was totally a response to doing all of this work around archaeology and ancient history, because as any archaeologist will tell you, the one tool that they all want is a time machine to be able to just go back and be like, oh, so that's what they were doing with that
Mm,
stuff. We were wondering. Um, and so I wrote a book about time travel because I was just feeling that frustration. And so that was a very nice release for me, to
yeah.
just kind of get all my feelings out about like how it would be to actually visit history, and of course screw it up completely, which is what time travelers always do. Um, so I think, um, my pie chart, like sometimes it's like lots of nonfiction, sometimes it's lots of fiction, but there's always the opposite going on in the background. So like right now, I'm in the final stages of finishing a novel, and I'm in the early stages of researching this book on psychological warfare. So I'm doing both, and it keeps my days interesting.
Got it. That's so interesting because I listened to both of those books. I have I've developed a really serious audio book habit because I'm going for these long pandemic walks. And
Yes.
I listened to both of the books last year, Future of Another Timeline and Four Lost Cities. And it was, I was listening to them and I was wondering, um, if you were writing them at the same time. It's interesting
Pretty
because
much.
your writing has been more past oriented. Your nonfiction writing, but your fiction, see, so it's almost like they're two different tools. Um, you use one to explore the future and one to explore the past, and maybe there's more overlap than that. But I thought that was. Do you think about it like that?
I mean, definitely. So my first nonfiction book, Scatter, Adapt, and Remember, is a
Hmm.
lot about the future. At least half the book is about the future. Um, and I think I think it would be accurate to say I'm really interested in deep time.
Hmm.
And I like having that slider where I can go way back and way forward. The novel I'm working on now is set about 60,000 years in the future. And that was really fun for me because I what I like to do when I'm world building for the future is kind of imagine, well, when we look back 60,000 years in the past, what do we see? And so will those future people look back at us as being kind of the way we look back at, humans 60,000 years ago? And so that's that was really it was really fun for me to try to imagine how we would turn into essentially Paleolithic people, and what that would mean if our culture is Paleolithic, what the future culture is. So anyway, I came up with some ideas for that. But so I think that that's what it is really, is that I like traveling in time and imagining both the past and the future, which both of those are speculative projects, since I don't have a time machine. And I mean, even if I did have a time machine and I went back, my observations would be biased. I'm just one
Yeah.
person. So you couldn't just trust me to tell you all about what I'd seen, because I'd be like, oh, they had really great noodles and
Yeah.
vegetarian food. I'm not going to tell you about the meat because I don't really eat that. So too bad. There was no meat in the past, because that's
Cool.
just all I saw was vegetables. So that's the
That's
problem
so
with history.
okay. I want to get to this, but I'm going to tell you one
Yeah.
story. I'm going to tell you one quick story,
Yeah.
and then I'll put a like a note in this in the notes so people can follow the whole thread. But I got invited randomly to go see the filming of James Cameron had this television series called the science of or the history of science fiction or the stories of science fiction. I forget what it was called. It
Yeah.
was. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I was in that series.
Yeah. But I went to the filming of the where he was interviewing Christopher Nolan,
Uh-huh.
and it would the whole conversation was about time travel,
I bet.
and
Yeah.
so that was a really interesting like uh I mean you can imagine, right, like Terminator and like Interstellar, like these two have been thinking so much about it. They had a really hard time defining it, and a really hard time talking about why it's become like a science fiction genre in and of itself. And in your other long now talk, I thought you did a fantastic job explaining it as a as a science fiction tool, but also as an important literary tool. So, anyways, we'll just jump in. I don't want to go too deep in that, but I'll let people go and listen to your long now talk. But I did want to tell you that because I think you did a great job explaining it.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah.
All right, so tell
Um,
me about the research that you were doing for Four Lost Cities.
okay. So Four Lost Cities came out earlier this year. And one of the things that's really fun to do when a book comes out is kind of write articles related to it that are like kind of picking up on threads from while you were doing your research, but you couldn't really build it into the book. And so my book is called Four Lost Cities, and one of these cities that is allegedly lost but was never lost is Çatalhöyük, which is a 9,000-year-old city in central Turkey. It's right near the large city of Konya, which is a city of about 1 million people. It's quite big. But outside Konya, there's this area where people lived thousands of years ago. And Çatalhöyük is a really fascinating city for lots of reasons, partly because it's really on the cusp of being a city. It's partly a village and partly a city. Some people call it a mega site or a mega village. Probably about 5,000 people lived there, which most people were living in villages of 50 to 100 people. So 5,000 people really was like the Manhattan of its day. And it was a city that was inhabited continuously for over 1,000 years. So it was very, very successful by any measure. It was a city that left behind no writing, although lots and lots of art was left behind, and a lot of material culture, everything from tools for making clothes, weapons, baskets, bowls, ritual items, all kinds of stuff. So it's up to the archaeologists to try to figure out how the heck people lived there based on just all the garbage basically that they left behind, all of the stuff. And it's very fascinating, and there's a lot of mysterious stuff in there. And one of the most mysterious items that I became obsessed with after visiting and seeing it for myself is that people at Çatalhöyük made these clay balls, which archaeologists refer to as clay balls. And they're about the size of baseballs. They're pressed clay. They're very smooth. So they're very, they're artisanal. People spent a long time smoothing them and pressing them and making them really nice. Some of them have designs on the outside. And they made hundreds of them. This is the thing that's so freaking weird, is in almost every house, you find a ton of these clay balls. Some of them are small. Some of them are the more baseball or almost like grapefruit sized. And they're usually found near the hearth. Every house has a homemade hearth for cooking and for, curing and other stuff. And so archaeologists are like, all right, I guess maybe they're for something related to cooking. And there've been all these hypotheses about how you would use them in cooking. We know that they were put into the hearth because some of them are burned and cracked. So, okay, I have this in the back of my head. Like one day I'm going to understand the balls of Çatalhöyük because
Hmm.
that's so weird. And so when my book came out, I started working on a story for Scientific American about home life at Çatalhöyük, and I knew that the clay balls would be at the center. So here's a little screen share of how my brain works when I'm doing this kind of research. So I started looking for, using Google Scholar, like anyone who'd written anything related to like
Hmm.
clay objects, tiny clay balls, big clay balls. Sometimes they're called tokens. So I found this scholar, Lucy Binnison Chapman, who had written about tokens at Çatalhöyük. And I found this article and I saved it to Evernote because I'm an old person and I still use Evernote.
Hmm.
And maybe someone will recommend something better to me. But anyway, so I had saved this. So then I'm like, okay, great. I'm going to track down Lucy Binnison Chapman. So then I went to her page on academia.edu, which is like every science journalist's best friend. And I discovered that she's done tons and tons of work at Çatalhöyük. So this is great. So she's legit. She's done all this work. So then this is like a true nerd thing that happened to me. So here you can see that she has a report. I'm just kind of zooming my pointer here.
Yeah.
That is from 2015, where she talks about geometric clay objects. Woo. Nothing more exciting than that. And it's from 2015. And she's like, oh, we found all these clay objects. And like, they're so mysterious. What are they? And like, she has a bunch of, like, let's go through there. No, I don't want to hear about that. So she's got pictures of them and, like, look at all these different clay balls.
Wow.
And it was just like awesome. And I was like, okay. And she's like, oh, and next year we'll find out more. And I was like, awesome. Okay. So what's going to happen next? So then I went and read. So then she had two. It's like I was reading a trilogy or something. So then she has the follow up here from 2016. She has a follow up in 2017. She's continuing to like learn more and more about the clay balls. They're doing like chemical analysis to see if the clay balls have been like exposed to different kinds of lipids, and like does that
Wow.
mean that they were put into a stew to cook the, like one theory has been that they would be heated up in the fire and then you put it into a stew to heat up the stew because they didn't have fired ceramics, so you couldn't
Huh.
put your pot right over the fire until later. They did actually eventually invent fired ceramics, so that was a great labor saving device. But anyway, so I got to the end of report in 2017 and it was like, next year maybe we'll figure this all out. And then they didn't do it next year. She didn't work on it next year. So I was like, frack. Okay, so I have
Uh,
to call Lucy. So that's when I get in touch with Lucy. And so let's see, what is this? So, oh, this is, you don't need to see that. So then I call up Lucy and have an interview with her, and I ask her all about her work. And so you can see I record the interview, and then I also chat with her. Like, here's my notes from our phone conversation. I type a lot. And then I'll highlight stuff that is particularly interesting. So one of the things that she told me was, actually we discovered that people were not dunking these balls inside of any kind of food. And so now she says, actually, we think it's really cold and people probably heated them up and put them inside their beds or inside their clothes to stay warm. Um, and
ah.
so I highlighted that and I used that in my article. But then I also have a section that I've highlighted for later where she told me right away that the way she figured out the size of the balls was she worked with a software engineer at NASA who had made software to measure the circumference of Pluto's moons. And he used that software to help her figure out the circumference of balls that had been cracked. And so that, because they'd been in the fire and they cracked in half. And so
Oh
she was
my
able
gosh.
to, like, this is data archaeology. Love it. Like, she has
Yeah.
hundreds of these balls and she's measuring all of the balls of Çatalhöyük, which also makes for a great kind of like AC/DC song or whatever. So she's looking to see who has the biggest balls at Chatal, who has the littlest balls, how many of the little ones and the big ones exist. And here's the other thing is Çatalhöyük is the only city that ever manufactures the big balls. So Çatalhöyük does in fact have the biggest balls of all of the other settlements have little balls, lots of little balls that they're using for all kinds of stuff. She thinks they might have been using them for heating, but also games, also kind of exchange, like objects for exchange and things like that. There's a whole complex idea about how people kind of had little balls that might have signaled their tribal identity or their family identity. So anyway, I finally get to the bottom of this mystery, which of course is still a mystery because we don't have a time machine. But the way that it happens is really because, you know, I'm a dork, I'm a nerd, and I get really obsessed over little things like where do these balls come from and why are they using them? And the answer turns out to be, like I said, kind of complex because basically they're little heaters, they're little bricks that people are heating up and they're using them for all kinds of things, such as warming up your bed at night or maybe keeping food warm. You know, maybe they'd heat up these balls and put them on the floor and then put grass on top and then like some fish or meat or something that they've heated up, some soup. So it's like a chafing dish or something. It's a very humble answer to a kind of a weird question. And a lot of science is like that, especially if you're looking at archaeology, which is really the science of understanding ancient human life. And, you know, humans do a lot of really humble stuff that isn't particularly earth shaking. You know, we do a lot of stuff like trying to stay warm at night and trying to keep our food warm for our friends who are, you know, out working in the fields. And so it was a delightful like journey of discovery because like I said, I'd always freaking wondered. And I had heard this story about how the balls were being used to cook. And it never made sense to me. It just, why would you put a clay ball? Like, why wouldn't you just use a rock for that? A clay ball is going to like slough off in your stew. You're going to get like a gritty, gross stew. And of course, it turns out that that wasn't true. Once we analyzed the chemicals on the outside of these balls, we knew that they had never been stuck into anyone's stew. So anyway, that is the fun story of the balls and Lucy Binnison Chapman, who has devoted her a lot of her career to studying tiny geometrical objects in ancient cities.
I love it.
Turns out tiny geometrical objects could be important. Like I have some right here. I have a tiny geometrical object that this is a 20-sided dice. One day there is definitely going to be an archaeologist who's like, I literally study 20-sided dice from the early 21st century. We're wondering what they did. Like maybe they used them to keep their hands warm.
Right, exactly. Oh, that's so funny. It's like biology trying to interpret what different species are doing.
And biology gets into whole other areas, but yeah, I mean, nothing more confusing than human culture, really.
That's so cool. And so it's fun to watch you pull threads and get to follow your interest. And I've done a little bit of this, like I've done a like end of writing, and I think this is such a joy. And also I was when reading Four Lost Cities, it's one of those things where you as a writer, I could like recognize that, oh, this would be actually a wildly fun book to write. Like it's just like it demands that you go to these places and ask these interesting questions. And anyways, I can just see how you got excited. So what is that? So what is the token? Does that turn in? You'd mentioned that it's like a piece. So is that going to be like a article that you're writing? Or is that...
it's out now. So it was an article I wrote for Scientific American. It just came out a couple months ago. So yeah, you can find it. If you just search for my name in Scientific American, I think it's called The Origins of Home. And there's all the balls you could possibly want, plus other stuff, you know, but yeah, that was really exciting.
The original NFTs.
I mean, could be. Oh my God, that would be, because, you know, some houses had way more balls than other houses. So that could be the blockchain house.
Amazing, amazing. Well, I know we only have a couple more minutes, but I do want to ask you the last question I ask everyone is what are your best ideas to make science better? And you've given me a lot already, but if you had to condense down that
Yeah,
recommendation, what would you do?
sure. Let me give you a quick recommendation and a little story to back it up. So I started by talking about how science really needs to have more diversity, and that's part of the scientific project, is to bring in as many types of people with as many backgrounds as possible. That always makes science better. I don't think there's any real argument against that, other than one's kind of fueled by unconscious bias. And so um, in working on archaeology stories, one of the things that comes up a lot is that archaeology is kind of originates in the West. It's a very Western type of scholarship, and so a lot of the time you get Westerners going into other nations, going to other continents, and trying to study the local cultures. And even with the best will, even with a lot of goodwill, um, if they don't include local people, indigenous people, or just the folks who live in the city that they're studying, they really have a lot of blind spots. And there's a great example in the city of Angkor, which I talk about in my book. It's one of the four cities. And for a long time, after Europeans began studying Angkor, there was this belief that all of the important writing at the city, because there's just like in ancient Rome, there's a ton of stuff just sort of engraved on the walls, like a lot of official, basically their equivalent of official documents and
Hmm.
histories. So people spend a lot of time, archaeologists spend a lot of time reading these and trying to interpret them. And a lot of them are written in Sanskrit. And Westerners had learned to translate Sanskrit around the turn of the 20th century. So they were familiar with Sanskrit, and they thought of Sanskrit as being the important language, the elevated language. Sanskrit in Cambodia, where the Khmer Empire kind of has its capital at Angkor, Sanskrit is an imported language. It's basically like writing in Latin. It's like when the French write in Latin in the year 500. Nobody's speaking Latin, but they're using it for their like official shit.
Hmm.
So there's a ton of stuff at Angkor that's written in Old Khmer, which is the precursor to the modern language Khmer that everyone speaks in
Hmm.
Cambodia. Um, and scholars were like, screw that. We don't care about that. That's just the language of the street. Uh, we don't want to know. We just only want to know about the Sanskrit stuff. And there's
Hmm.
actually a scholar who writes a paper referring to Old Khmer inscriptions as being interminable lists of names. Ugh, why would we want to look at that? So in the 1950s and 60s, a young Cambodian woman who is interested in anthropology and archaeology, she goes and studies in France. Her name is Bao Savras, and she gets a kind of a classical archaeology education, but she's rooted in Cambodian culture. And she's like, you know what? I think I actually want to study all that Old Khmer.
Hmm.
And she produces the first dictionary of Old Khmer, translated into French, because she's, of course, educated in France. But there are now English translations. And by translating that, what we get is a record of all of the economic dealings of the
Hmm.
ancient Khmer Empire, which is freaking important. And it
Hmm.
was just a tradition in ancient Khmer culture to do kind of elevated spiritual writing in Sanskrit, but all their everyday stuff, the stuff that we actually care about, was written in Old Khmer. And so we were able to decipher this huge piece of history just because finally a person who came from the culture that was being studied got a seat at the table.
Hmm.
And that is just one small example of how incredibly useful it is to have diverse voices in science, because
Hmm.
without her, we would not understand like the economics of the Khmer Empire, which are incredibly complex and are still, a subject of great scholarly interest.
Hmm.
So yay diversity, yay working with local knowledge. I think that's the other piece of it, is just always, if you're coming into a space, whether it's a wilderness space or a historical space, it's just science needs to scientists need to have many, many seats at the table for people who may not have the perfect science education that they're used to, but actually know the culture and are like, actually,
Right.
Maybe we should read the language that people were writing in. Just a thought.
Totally.
Yeah.
Well, that kind of, I don't know if this is going full circle, but it kind of reminds me of what we were just talking about the infrastructure, or like the Green New Deal, of the importance of having that kind of creative vision when we set these kind of direction, when we set out in these new directions. And um, maybe we need better science fiction about the scientific process itself. Maybe we need maybe we need more of that. Anyways,
Yeah,
just an
I'm
idea.
working on it. My new novel has a huge amount of time spent with people who are gathering field samples and
Oh,
are doing
wonderful.
an environmental survey in order to build public transit. So there's lots and lots of nerd stuff.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, well, I'm
Yeah,
excited for all of it. Um,
I'm
well,
excited for you to see it.
awesome. Okay, cool. Well, thank you so much for your time, and hopefully we'll get to do this again.
Yeah, lovely. It was so nice to see you.
Likewise. Bye.